Arthur Sterling never truly saw Elena, not until her secret night routine forced him to confront the gaping chasm between their worlds. He was a titan of industry, a man whose name echoed in the glass canyons of Manhattan and whispered through the manicured hedges of the Hamptons. His estate, the Sterling Spire, was a monument to his relentless ambition, a sprawling modern fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Atlantic. Every surface gleamed, every corner breathed order, a reflection of Arthur's meticulously curated life. His days were a symphony of high-stakes calls, market analyses, and power lunches. His nights a quiet solitude punctuated only by the soft hum of the mansion's automated systems. Elena Rodriguez was merely a cog in this perfectly oiled machine, the quiet, efficient maid who materialized at 7 a.m., a ghost in crisp uniform, and vanished by 5 p.m., leaving behind a trail of pristine perfection. She was one of many faces in his vast staff, indispensable but ultimately invisible. Her role was to maintain the facade, a silent guardian of his comfort, and he paid her handsomely for it, never giving a second thought to the life she lived outside the manicured lawns of his estate. His normalcy was a cocoon of luxury. Each morning, a bespoke suit was laid out, a gourmet breakfast appeared as if by magic, and his driver, Jenkins, waited with the polished Rolls-Royce. Arthur read the Wall Street Journal with an almost surgical precision, dissecting market trends, always 2 steps ahead. He prided himself on his foresight, his ability to spot a weakness, an opportunity, a deception, long before anyone else. This was his superpower, honed over decades in the cutthroat world of finance. It was this ingrained suspicion, this constant search for the hidden agenda, that now pricked at his subconscious, turning a mundane observation into a creeping unease. The first fissure appeared subtly, a hairline crack in his perfectly ordered universe. One Tuesday evening, Arthur, unusually restless after a particularly grueling day of trying to close a hostile takeover, decided to forego his usual late-night whiskey and instead wander through his own mansion. The house was a labyrinth, even to him, with wings he rarely visited. He was making his way to the seldom-used library to retrieve an old, leather-bound financial history when he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible clink from the east wing, a section of the house dedicated to storage and staff quarters, far from the grand living areas. His watch showed 9:17 p.m. Elena's shift had ended hours ago. His first thought, chillingly rational, was security breach. He moved silently, his expensive leather slippers making no sound on the polished marble. Reaching the utility corridor, a dimly lit stretch lined with forgotten cleaning supplies and maintenance panels, he saw it, a sliver of light escaping from under the door of what was supposed to be an unused service room, a place where old furniture and discarded decor were stored. The door, usually locked, was ajar, and through the gap he caught a glimpse of movement. It was Elena. She was inside, long after she should have been gone. His gut clenched. Theft. It was the only logical explanation. His mind, trained in the brutal calculus of profit and loss, immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. Why else would a maid, clocking out hours ago, be lurking in a restricted area? His initial judgment, cold and unyielding, was cemented. She's trying to exploit me. Maybe she's casing the joint or stashing stolen goods. The audacity of it, under his very roof, in his sanctuary of control. It felt like a personal affront, a direct challenge to his unparalleled perception. He felt a familiar surge of anger, a silent promise to himself that he would unravel this, expose her, and make an example. This was his domain, and no one, especially not an employee, would undermine his authority or his assets. He didn't confront her immediately. That wasn't Arthur's style. He preferred to gather intelligence, to understand the enemy's pattern before striking. He retreated as silently as he had come, his heart now thumping with a mix of suspicion and a strange, almost juvenile thrill. This was a new kind of game, one played on his home turf, with higher stakes than mere dollars. The next morning, he made discreet calls. Security cameras, already pervasive on the estate's perimeter, would now have their feeds redirected. He even had a microcamera, the size of a pinhead, installed in the utility corridor, aimed directly at that service room door. He was building his case, piece by painstaking piece. A few nights later, the surveillance began. Arthur sat in his private study, a glass of single malt untouched beside him, his eyes fixed on a monitor displaying the grainy feed. At 9:00 p.m., like clockwork, Elena appeared, dressed in the same simple, practical clothes she wore under her uniform. She unlocked the service room door with a key he hadn't known she possessed, slipped inside and closed it softly behind her. Arthur zoomed in, his brow furrowed. He expected to see her rummaging through boxes, perhaps concealing a valuable trinket in her bag. But what he saw was far more perplexing. She wasn't stealing. She was arranging. Books, children's books to be precise. Old worn copies of The Velveteen Rabbit and Charlotte's Web, faded picture books, and even a well-loved copy of Dr. Seuss's Oh, the Places You'll Go. She handled them with an almost sacred reverence, carefully aligning them on a makeshift shelf constructed from old wooden crates. Then she pulled out a small, tattered blanket from her bag, smoothed it over a worn armchair that Arthur recognized as a cast-off from a guest bedroom, and sat down. His initial fury began to morph into a grudging bewilderment. What was this? A secret reading club? A makeshift library? His highly logical mind struggled to process this deviation from his expected criminal narrative. As he watched, she picked up one of the books, Goodnight Moon, and opened it. She didn't read it aloud, not exactly. Her lips moved, her gaze soft, almost wistful. It was a silent performance, a private ritual. Arthur leaned closer to the screen, his curiosity now eclipsing his anger. He saw her gently run her finger over a page, then touch it to her lips, a gesture of profound tenderness. This was a micro-trigger, a tiny emotional spark. He knew that specific book. It was his daughter's favorite when she was little. A fleeting, almost painful memory of reading it to her, his voice a rumbling monotone, came unbidden. He dismissed it quickly, shaking his head. Still, it's peculiar behavior, he thought, and unauthorized. But the certainty of her malice, the conviction that she was a thief, had begun to fray at the edges. Arthur's nights, once dedicated to strategic planning or the occasional deep dive into market analysis, now revolved around Elena's mysterious routine. The hidden camera in the utility corridor had become his personal looking glass into a world he didn't understand. He felt like a modern-day Sherlock Holmes, albeit one trading the fog of Baker Street for the sterile glow of a surveillance monitor. The thrill of the chase was still there, but the expected payoff, the satisfying confirmation of her guilt, remained stubbornly out of reach. Each night, Elena would enter the service room, meticulously arrange the children's books, occasionally adding new ones she brought in a worn canvas tote, and then she would sit. She'd read aloud in a soft, melodic voice, stories that evoked forgotten innocence. Sometimes she would simply sit in silence, holding a book, her eyes distant, her expression a mix of sorrow and profound longing. He had expected to catch her red-handed, to expose her greed. Instead, he was witnessing something utterly bizarre, something that chipped away at his carefully constructed cynicism. His life, usually about mega deals and billion-dollar swings, was now consumed by a maid's baffling after-hours activity. He'd even canceled a late-night conference call with his London team, claiming a sudden migraine, just to observe her. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he wouldn't admit it. He, Arthur Sterling, the man who owned half of Manhattan, was prioritizing spying on his maid over international business. One evening, as she read from Where the Wild Things Are, her voice barely a whisper, a strange sound emerged from her, a soft, almost imperceptible sniffle. Arthur zoomed in. Her shoulders were shaking. She was crying, silently, tears tracing paths down her usually stoic face. It was a raw, unguarded moment, utterly at odds with the composed professional he knew. This was another micro-trigger, a sharp jolt to his detached observation. It stirred a forgotten memory, a distant echo of his own mother, frail and tearful, reading to him during a stormy night when he was a boy. He'd repressed that memory, deemed it weak, but now it resurfaced, an unwanted guest in his meticulously ordered mind. He found himself inexplicably rooting for her to stop crying, to find some solace in her solitary ritual. It was an uncomfortable, unfamiliar sensation. He decided to subtly increase the pressure. He believed he was cornering her, making her nervous, hoping she would slip up and reveal her true intentions. He began leaving mistakes for her to correct. a valuable antique letter opener left conspicuously on a low table just within reach. A small stack of $100 bills, seemingly forgotten on his bedside table. He'd watched the footage, expecting her to pocket them, to betray her supposed innocence. But she never did. The letter opener was returned to its proper display case, the bills placed neatly on his desk with a polite note. "Mr. Sterling, you left this on your nightstand." Her unwavering honesty was, paradoxically, more infuriating than any theft. It defied his narrative, challenged his very understanding of human nature, especially those who served him. He felt a twisted sense of accomplishment in his surveillance, believing his silent pressure was working, making her more cautious. This was his false exit, his belief that he had the situation under control, that he was simply waiting for the inevitable confession or mistake. He even tried a direct, albeit veiled, approach. One morning, he made sure she was dusting in his study when he was present. "Elena," he said without looking up from his tablet, his voice carefully neutral, "I trust you find everything in order with the staff quarters. Any unusual activity recently?" His gaze flicked to her, sharp and probing. Elena paused, her duster momentarily still. "Everything is fine, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice soft but firm, meeting his gaze without flinching. "No unusual activity I'm aware of." Her composure was unnerving. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't confessing. She wasn't even hinting at anything. His carefully laid trap seemed to bounce right off her quiet dignity. This made him reconsider. Perhaps she was incredibly good at playing innocent, or perhaps he was wrong. The thought was fleeting, swiftly dismissed. Arthur Sterling was never wrong, not about people, not about motives. His world was built on that certainty. But the seed of doubt, once planted, began to sprout. He decided a deeper dive into her background was necessary. He instructed his private investigator, a former NYPD detective named Malone, to dig into Elena Rodriguez, birth certificate, social security, previous addresses, work history, family, every detail. He wanted to know everything. Malone's report arrived a few days later, a thick dossier filled with dates and facts. Elena Rodriguez, 32, immigrated from El Salvador with her parents at age 10, attended community college briefly, no criminal record, spotless work history, one older brother, Miguel, who lived in Queens, and then a detail that made Arthur pause, a name that jumped out from the page, Mateo Rodriguez, B. 2018, D. 2022. Her son, he died 4 months ago. The cause listed was accidental drowning. A sudden, sharp intake of breath. The cold, analytical part of Arthur's brain momentarily shut down. Mateo, her son. He remembered seeing a small, faded photograph tucked into her purse once, a quick glimpse of a cheerful boy with bright eyes. It was a micro-trigger, a memory now searingly painful in its context. The children's books, the quiet readings, the tears. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about theft. This was about grief. Profound, aching grief. The service room, with its makeshift shelves and tattered blanket, wasn't a stash house for stolen goods. It was a sanctuary for a broken heart, a quiet space where a mother could connect with the ghost of her lost child, reading the stories they never got to finish. What would you have done, caught between suspicion and an unnerving sense of mystery? Would you have pressed on, believing your instincts, or would a flicker of doubt have led you to a different conclusion? Arthur felt a wave of nausea. He, the great Arthur Sterling, who prided himself on his keen insights, had reduced a woman's devastating loss to a common crime. His certainty, his unwavering belief in her malice, now felt like a lead weight in his stomach. He had been so utterly, irrevocably wrong. His false resolution, his self-congratulatory surveillance, now felt like a grotesque mockery of a grieving mother. The shame began to burn, slow and steady. Elena's quiet dignity, which had so frustrated Arthur's attempts to unnerve her, now shone with a different light. It wasn't defiance. It was resilience. Her unwavering composure, far from being a sign of cunning, was a shield, a silent testament to a strength born of unimaginable pain. Arthur looked at the dossier again, the name Mateo Rodriguez, the 2022, staring back at him like an accusation. His cold clinical investigation had inadvertently unearthed a tragedy, and in doing so had exposed the profound callousness of his own judgment. The subtle pressures he'd applied, the mistakes he'd laid out like bait, the veiled confrontation, they weren't the moves of a master strategist. They were the clumsy, cruel proddings of an ignorant man. Each action now felt like a jab to a gaping wound. He continued to watch her in the evenings, but his gaze was no longer that of a prosecutor. It was that of a penitent. He saw her now through the lens of the report, through the prism of Mateo. When she ran her finger over the pages of Goodnight Moon, he no longer saw a possible cover-up. He saw a mother tracing the words her son would never learn to read himself. When she quietly wept, his internal commentary shifted from, "She's trying to manipulate me," to, "She's breaking silently, alone." The weight of his misjudgment began to settle, heavy and suffocating. The vast, sterile mansion, which had always been a symbol of his power and control, now felt like a mausoleum for his own empathy. One afternoon, Arthur noticed Elena left her small, worn canvas tote bag in the utility corridor, momentarily forgotten as she rushed to attend to a spill in the dining room. His impulse before reading Malone's report would have been to open it, search for incriminating evidence. Now, he hesitated. The thought of violating her privacy, of desecrating the remnants of her grief, made him recoil. But a new, morbid curiosity, a desperate need for understanding, compelled him. He reached into the bag, not to steal, but to connect, to understand the depth of her loss. His fingers brushed against a small handmade drawing, folded carefully. He pulled it out. It was a child's crayon drawing, vibrant and messy. A stick figure boy with a wide, innocent smile, holding hands with a stick figure woman, standing in front of a brightly colored house. Scrawled underneath, in a child's uneven hand, were the words, "Mama and Mateo." It was a micro-trigger that struck him with the force of a physical blow. The simple, heartfelt artwork, a testament to a pure, uncomplicated love, brought tears to his own eyes. This wasn't just sentimental fluff, as he had initially dismissed it. This was the raw, unvarnished truth of a life brutally interrupted. He pictured Mateo, the smiling boy from the drawing, and imagined him, breathless and joyful, running through the house, the kind of vibrant presence that would have shattered the mansion's sterile silence. Arthur felt a knot of shame tighten in his chest. He, Arthur Sterling, who had once prided himself on his shrewd judgment, was now crumbling before a child's crayon drawing. He carefully folded the drawing and tucked it back into her bag, his hands trembling. The internal debate raged. Should he fire her? Not because of suspicion, but because his presence, his unwitting intrusion into her grief, felt monstrous. Or should he dig deeper, try to understand the specifics of her secret night routine, now that he knew its tragic context? His pride, an old, formidable foe, clashed with this nascent, unfamiliar feeling of empathy. He'd always believed in moving forward, in cutting losses, in emotion being a weakness. But this wasn't a business deal. This was a human being, suffering under his very roof, and he had made her suffering worse with his arrogant assumptions. That night, he didn't just watch the monitor. He decided to confront the truth head-on, not with accusations, but with an open, if terrified, heart. He waited until Elena had entered the service room. Then, taking a deep, shaky breath, he walked down the utility corridor. His hand, usually steady, trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob. He pushed it open, not with a forceful display of authority, but with a quiet, almost tentative gesture. The room was not what he expected. It was indeed a makeshift classroom, but not for children. It was a space designed for one. The old armchair was there, illuminated by a single soft lamp. Books were neatly arranged, and sitting in the armchair, not reading aloud, but holding a faded copy of The Little Prince to her chest, was Elena. Her eyes were closed, tears still tracing paths down her cheeks, but her face held an expression of profound, almost ethereal peace. She was rocking gently, a silent lullaby for a child no longer there. And beside her, on a small, rickety table, next to a wilting single white rose in a glass, was a tiny framed photograph. It was the same boy from the crayon drawing, Mateo, his smile wide and infectious. But beneath the photo, a single sheet of paper was carefully laid out, covered in Elena's neat handwriting. It wasn't a diary entry. It was a schedule. A schedule for Mateo's nightly adventures. Each line detailed a book to be read, a song to be hummed, a quiet moment of play acting. Monday, Goodnight Moon and Rocket Ship Journey to the Stars. Tuesday, Where the Wild Things Are and Monster Roaring. Wednesday, The Little Prince and Talk About Stars. The truth wasn't just revealed, it was laid bare, raw and heartbreaking. This was her nightly ritual, her desperate, beautiful attempt to keep her son's memory alive, to finish the stories they had started, to live out the adventures they had planned. It was a private act of profound, agonizing love, the roles inverted with brutal efficiency. Arthur Sterling, the billionaire, was not the shrewd protector of his assets. He was the intrusive, unfeeling observer. Elena, the maid he had suspected of petty crime, was a mother, performing the most sacred act of remembrance. His suspicions hadn't just been wrong, they had been a desecration. He felt a profound sense of shame, a burning humiliation that transcended anything he had ever experienced in the cutthroat world of business. He stood there, frozen, the weight of his colossal error pressing down on him, watching Elena, his heart twisting with a pain that was not his own, yet felt acutely personal. He was an intruder in the most sacred of spaces. Arthur stood frozen in the doorway, a colossal shadow cast by the single soft lamp. The air in the tiny room, thick with silent grief and maternal love, felt heavier than any boardroom, more charged than any trading floor. Elena's eyes remained closed, lost in her private communion, completely unaware of the hulking figure now bearing witness to her most intimate sorrow. He saw the photograph of Matteo, the schedule of Matteo's nightly adventures, and his gaze fell back to Elena, cradling the little prince against her chest. He understood now. This was her shrine, her nightly vigil, her way of defying the finality of death, of keeping her son close in the only way she knew how. He felt like a voyeur, not just of her space, but of her very soul. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and calculation, was in disarray. Every cynical thought he'd harbored about her, every suspicion, every judgment, now crashed down, replaced by a wave of raw, unadulterated shame. He, Arthur Sterling, had spent days meticulously tracking a grieving mother, believing her to be a thief, while she was simply trying to navigate the desolate landscape of loss. The superficiality of his own existence, driven by acquisition and power, suddenly felt utterly meaningless next to the profound, selfless love he was witnessing. He turned his head slightly, his eyes catching sight of an old, faded newspaper clipping tucked under a stack of books. He carefully picked it up, his fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The headline, dated 4 months prior, screamed, "Community Center Drowning Claims Young Boy." The article detailed the tragic accident at a local community pool, a momentary lapse in supervision, a swift and irreversible loss. It described a frantic mother, inconsolable, and a community stunned by the suddenness of the event. It confirmed Matteo's death, adding layers of heartbreaking detail to Malone's brief report. The story mentioned the center's struggle with funding, its dilapidated pool facilities, and the desperate pleas for better safety measures, which had gone largely unheeded by local authorities. This was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a systemic failure, a quiet injustice simmering beneath the surface of a seemingly affluent community. Elena wasn't just grieving, she was carrying the weight of a preventable loss. The revelation was another micro-trigger, igniting not just empathy, but a spark of righteous anger on her behalf. He thought of his own children, grown and distant, but always safe, always protected by the impenetrable wall of his wealth. He'd never had to worry about a faulty pool filter or a lack of lifeguards. The contrast was stark, almost unbearable. He swallowed hard, the knot in his throat making it difficult to breathe. The cold, sterile opulence of his mansion suddenly felt like a cage, trapping him in his own privileged isolation. He had lived his life believing that money solved everything, that it created an impenetrable barrier against the world's harsh realities. But here, in this humble, grief-stricken room, he saw the devastating limits of his wealth. It couldn't buy back Matteo. It couldn't mend Elena's broken heart, and it certainly couldn't buy him out of the profound moral debt he now felt. He backed away slowly, his movements careful, as if afraid to disturb the sanctity of her grief. He couldn't face her now, not after what he'd seen, not after what he'd thought. The depth of her pain, the quiet strength of her love, shamed him to his core. He retreated to his study, The dossier and the newspaper clipping spread out before him like evidence of his own moral bankruptcy. He poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, but the amber liquid offered no solace. Arthur sat there for hours, the image of Elena rocking in the small room seared into his mind. He remembered her gentle voice, her stoic demeanor, the way she carefully dusted every ornament, treated every book in his vast library with respect. He had seen her as a drone, a utility, a functionary in his grand scheme. Now he saw her as a hero, a woman battling an invisible adversary, grief, with nothing but love and memory. His initial judgments, so swift and absolute, felt like a lifetime ago. He saw now that his pride, his unwavering belief in his own infallible judgment, had blinded him. He hadn't just misjudged Elena, he had completely failed to see her humanity, reducing her to a stereotype. This realization was a painful, gut-wrenching truth. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a character flaw, an inherent arrogance that had kept him isolated and emotionally stunted. He had built an empire, but at what cost? He looked at the vast, empty rooms of his mansion, the expensive art, the antique furniture, none of it truly lived in. And then he pictured Elena, in her small, makeshift sanctuary, her heart overflowing with love and sorrow, creating a space more meaningful than any he possessed. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He, the man of infinite means, had infinitely less in terms of emotional wealth. The quiet, almost religious reverence Elena showed for her son's memory, for simple children's books, was a stark mirror reflecting his own barren soul. He felt a profound sense of emptiness, a hollowness that even his billions couldn't fill. He had never truly learned how to love, how to connect, how to feel in the way Elena so effortlessly did. This painful, overwhelming realization was the true beginning of his moral awakening. The following days were a blur for Arthur, haunted by the images from the utility room. His usual razor-sharp focus on business deals dulled, replaced by a constant, nagging replay of Elena's grief and his own monumental error. He saw her in the mansion now, and his gaze was different. No longer suspicious or dismissive, it was laden with a profound sense of guilt and an unfamiliar, burgeoning respect. He noticed the slight slump in her shoulders, the faint dark circles under her eyes, the quiet efficiency born of habit, not disinterest. He saw the sheer physical and emotional toll her life must be taking, the balancing act of serving the wealthy by day and mourning a lost child by night. His emotional discovery was complete. He wasn't just wrong about Elena, he was wrong about himself. His judgment wasn't keen, it was cruel. His power wasn't a shield, it was a blinding force, isolating him from the very essence of human experience. He, the master of his universe, was a profound failure where it mattered most, in empathy and understanding. He saw his own father's cold, demanding nature reflected in his own actions, a generational legacy of emotional distance. The memory of his father's dismissive glare when young Arthur expressed an interest in art, not finance, flashed in his mind, and he felt a chilling parallel to how he had dismissed Elena's entire being. This was the painful, undeniable realization of his own flaw, his own inherited blindness. He found himself walking past the utility corridor almost obsessively, listening, catching glimpses of her through the crack in the door. He witnessed her silently read to the empty chair, trace the illustrations, sometimes simply sit, lost in thought. He heard her hum a faint, melancholic tune, a lullaby that vibrated with unspoken sorrow. Each observation chipped away further at his hardened exterior, exposing a raw nerve he hadn't known existed. The simple, profound humanity of her suffering made his empire, his billions, feel insignificant, even vulgar. Arthur knew he couldn't ignore this. His conscience, long dormant, was now screaming. But what could he do? Apologize? Offer money? Both felt inadequate, almost insulting, given the depth of her loss and his own transgression. He considered simply increasing her salary, a quiet gesture of atonement, but it felt hollow. It wouldn't address the core problem, his moral failure, his role in perpetuating the very systems that allowed tragedies like Mateo's to occur, and his personal judgment of her. His internal conflict was immense. His pride, the cornerstone of his identity, urged him to remain silent, to pretend he hadn't seen, hadn't judged. To admit his error, especially to an employee, felt like an act of self-immolation, but his burgeoning conscience, fueled by the image of Elena's quiet grief, pushed him towards action, towards some form of atonement. He had always chosen power over compassion, money over conscience. This was different. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. The choice was not logical. It was purely, painfully emotional. He remembered a small detail from the newspaper clipping. The community center where Matteo drowned was struggling financially, its facilities dilapidated. There was talk of permanent closure. This was it. This was his path, not just to help Elena, but to mend in some small way a piece of the broken world he had so blithely ignored. But how? Anonymously? Or with a full humiliating confession of his initial baseless suspicions? The latter would be a public admission of his flawed character, a blow to his carefully crafted image as the infallible tycoon. Have you ever let your pride blind you to someone else's quiet heroism? Have you ever had to choose between protecting your reputation and doing the right thing, even if it meant exposing your own vulnerability? Arthur wrestled with this question, pacing his opulent study late into the night. His usual solutions, throwing money at a problem, having his lawyers handle it, or orchestrating a discreet maneuver, felt utterly insufficient. This demanded more. It demanded a piece of him, a sacrifice of his ingrained arrogance. One evening, he watched Elena through the camera feed, reading a story about a brave knight and a hidden kingdom. Her voice, though soft, carried a resonance, a quiet strength that belied her gentle demeanor. It was a micro-trigger that crystallized his decision. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't seeking pity. She was simply enduring, loving, and remembering. His intervention, whatever form it took, had to respect that dignity. It had to be about her, about Matteo, about the injustice, not about his own ego. He couldn't just throw money at the community center. He had to engage, to understand, to be truly present. The loneliness that had shadowed his success, the emotional void he had filled with acquisition, now felt palpable. He understood that redemption wouldn't come from a simple financial transaction, but from a profound change in himself, a dismantling of the walls he had built around his heart. He had to face her, not as the all-powerful employer, but as a fallible human being, burdened by his own mistakes, seeking a different kind of wealth. The morning air in the Hamptons was crisp, tinged with the scent of salt and privilege. Arthur, for the first time in years, felt utterly exposed, stripped of his usual defenses. He had spent the night rehearsing what he would say, discarding every practiced corporate apology, every calculated offer. Nothing felt right. He knew he had to be raw, honest, and utterly vulnerable. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an act of contrition. He waited for Elena in the kitchen, a place he rarely frequented, preferring his staff to prepare and serve his meals discreetly. She entered at precisely 7 a.m., her uniform pristine, her movements as quiet and efficient as ever. She nodded a polite good morning, her eyes as always guarded. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound unusually loud in the vast, silent kitchen. "Elena," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. "I need to speak with you, in my study." Her composure faltered, just for a moment. A flicker of surprise, then resignation, crossed her face. She probably thought she was about to be fired or chastised for some perceived infraction. She followed him down the long corridor, her footsteps softer than his, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. In the study, surrounded by the symbols of his immense power, Arthur felt incredibly small. He gestured to a chair, and Elena sat, poised and quiet, her hands clasped in her lap. He walked to his imposing desk, then turned, avoiding its shield. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. "Elena," he started again, his voice cracking, "I owe you an apology, a profound one." He took a deep breath. I've been watching you, at night, in the service room." Her eyes widened, a flash of fear, then a deep settling sadness. She didn't speak, just held his gaze. "I saw the books," he continued, the words tumbling out, "the pictures, the schedule. I read the news article about Matteo, and I realize now how terribly wrong I was, how utterly shameful my suspicions were." The admission, so long repressed, felt like tearing open an old wound. His voice trembled, and a burning sensation pricked his eyes. I thought you were stealing from me. I assumed the worst. My pride, my arrogance, it blinded me. I reduced your grief, your immense love for your son, to a petty crime. And I am so incredibly sorry." He looked away, unable to maintain eye contact, the weight of his confession crushing him. He felt tears welling, hot and unexpected. Arthur Sterling, the unflappable titan, the man who hadn't cried since his own mother's funeral decades ago, felt his composure crumble. The dam of his carefully constructed emotional detachment burst. He wasn't just crying for Elena's loss, he was crying for his own lost humanity, for the decades he had lived in an emotional desert, for the son he had failed to truly connect with, for the father he had become. He was crying for the profound shame of his judgment, the chilling realization of how isolated and devoid of true connection his life had been. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his raw, unfiltered grief. Elena, the maid he had judged, sat motionless, watching the billionaire weep. When he finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen, Elena was still there. She had not left. Her expression was not one of triumph or anger, but of a quiet, compassionate understanding. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice soft but steady, "you don't owe me an explanation. You don't owe me anything." "Yes," he whispered, "I do. I owe you justice. For Matteo. For that community center." He composed himself, finding a new kind of strength in his vulnerability. "I want to help, not just with money but with genuine support. I want to rebuild that community center, to make sure no other child suffers Matteo's fate. I want to fund it, secure it, make it a sanctuary for children, and I want to do it in Matteo's name. With your guidance, Elena." It was his choice, not of logic, but of profound emotional resonance. He was offering not just his fortune, but his influence, his time, his very reputation. He would publicly back the project, making a statement that would inevitably lead to questions about his sudden philanthropic turn. It was a renunciation of his purely self-serving legacy, a confession of his initial error, a symbolic punishment for his arrogance. Elena looked at him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "Matteo would have liked that," she said, her voice barely audible. "He loved to swim." Arthur dedicated himself to the project with an intensity usually reserved for hostile takeovers. He poured millions into the Matteo Rodriguez Community Center, rebuilding the pool, hiring staff, creating educational programs. He even spent weekends there, not just observing, but engaging, reading stories to the children, something he never did for his own. His name, once synonymous with ruthless finance, now carried a new association with community and compassion. He found a new purpose, a true wealth of meaning that his billions had never provided. Elena remained his maid, but their relationship was irrevocably changed. A silent understanding, a profound respect, existed between them. She continued her quiet night routine in the service room, but now, sometimes Arthur would join her, not to spy, but to simply sit in the quiet, shared space, listening to her soft voice read stories that healed more than just her own heart. The justice was done. The community center thrived, a testament to Matteo's memory. But Arthur Sterling, the billionaire, carried the emotional loss of decades spent in emotional isolation, the profound weight of his past judgments. His bank account remained intact, but his heart finally was full, albeit scarred. He looked at Elena, not as an employee, but as a mirror reflecting his own barren soul, and he knew then that his bank account was fuller than ever, but his heart had finally found its first true deposit. "Tell me, what would you have done when faced with a truth that shatters your entire world?"